In 1941, when the Russian-German War broke out, my husband was mobilized into the Soviet military, and I, with my 2 children, a daughter aged 7 and a boy aged 3 years old, remained alone, living at home in the city of Chortkiv, western Ukraine. I survived innumerable slaughters. The first Jewish victims in our shtetl fell only a few days after the occupation of our region by the Germans. They ordered a few hundred Jewish men to gather in a square for work. The men gathered in the square, but instead of taking them to work, they took them to prison, and later the Germans, together with the local Ukrainians, murdered them in a brutal fashion, and they buried some alive. These were the best people from our city. A few days later, we received news from my hometown, Zalishchiki, 5 kilometers from us, where my parents and sisters still lived, that the Gestapo there had issued an order. 500 Jews should come to clean the barracks. If they would not heed the command, they would kill all the Jews of the city. The order was fulfilled, and all 500 Jews were taken to a place outside the city. They lined them up 10 in a row, one behind the other, and each row was shot with 1 bullet. Obviously, from such shooting, most were only wounded, and some were not even touched, but the Germans ignored this and buried them all alive. Among the victims were my father and my 2 younger sisters, aged 18 and 20 years old. In March 1942, they carried out among us in the shtetl the first formal slaughter, and immediately after this, they ordered us to move into the ghetto. I went to the ghetto with my children. The conditions there were terrible. After only 6 weeks, they sent us to Zalishchiki. After laboring 3 months in Zalishchiki, in September 1942, an order arrived that the camp there must be free of Jews. Then they sent us to Tovste. Tovste was an assembly point for the murder of Jews, and we arrived here exactly as they were carrying out an extermination action. I managed to hide, together with my children. We did not rest for long. In a few weeks' time, there once again took place here a slaughter, during which over 2,000 Jews were killed. The panic in the city was terrible, because no one had imagined that so quickly, after such a short breathing space, another slaughter would take place. I hid in a cellar, together with my children and another 7 people. Altogether, there were 10 of us. That winter, we remained in Tovste. In the beginning of May 1943, there again took place here a great slaughter. My family, the 3 of us, hid in an attic and thus survived. Lying here a few days, my younger child seemed to understand the situation and did not even ask for water. During the time in the attic, we heard heart-rending cries, screams, and calls for help. Many of the victims fled, but the local population, the Ukrainians, chased after them, beat them, and later murdered them in a terrible fashion. Those few Jews who remained alive, in hiding, were later sorted. The older people were sent to Chortkiv and the younger to the camps. Together with my family, I stole out from the camp at night, and we set out for Lisivtsi, 7 kilometers from Tovste. For 6 weeks it was calm, and then they again began a Jewish action. We fled from the city with a group of people, but we were noticed by the Germans, and they immediately opened fire on us with machine guns. Straight away, there were 32 victims from our group. Among them was my mother. My daughter was hit by a bullet in her foot, but we were already in the field. We hid among the crops until nightfall. At night, with great effort, we returned to Tovste. The first medical help that my daughter received was from Dr. Greenberg. Later, when the situation in Tovste was again in a state of tension, we once more left for Lisivtsi. In Lisivtsi, there was still a camp of 200 Jews who worked at agricultural labor, the men in the stables and the women in the fields. We received food once per day. The Ukrainian police would very often fall upon our camp and murder whoever fell into their hands. Likewise, due to the hunger and terrible living conditions, a typhus epidemic broke out. Here, the Ukrainians did not take care of the sick, and anyone who became ill was immediately shot. No one reacted to all of this, because the law was to beat the Jews. March 1st, 1944, when the Soviet armies advanced, the Germans and Ukrainians, together with the Vlasovites, became completely wild and dealt out murder right and left. They caught a Jewish woman from Vienna with her son and shot them. A woman from the shtetl, Igolnitz, they took a knife. Her ears and nose, and afterwards they shot her. March 23, 1944, the Soviets liberated our region. We were 8 days with the Soviets when the Germans again renewed their attack, and the town once again passed to their hands. Then, in a burning frost, starving, exhausted, naked, and barefoot, we fled for 60 kilometers to Chernivtsi. Many of us froze. We had to leave them on the way. We remained in Chernivtsi until the end of the war.
The following is the testimony of Max Rüssler, aged 30 at the time, who describes the liquidation of the Wieliczka ghetto in March 1943, the mass execution of Jews near Niepołomice, and the living conditions and forced labor in the concentration camps in Rozwadów and Stalowa Wola. On the 27th of August 1942, expulsion from Wieliczka, Jewish evacuees from Krakow taken. They had lived there since the autumn of 1940 and were expelled from Wieliczka with the local inhabitants. All the Jews there, about 11,000, had to assemble in a square. Around 2,000 Jews that were old and sick were sorted out, put into trucks with the help of the Polish collaborators, and brought into Niepolomsker forest. There they were immediately executed. On the 1st of September 1942, we came to the SS camp in Rozwadów. The SS Corporal Schwamberger was the commander of the camp. His deputy was the Unterscharführer Buschdock. They also had a German Sturmmann for help and 30 Ukrainians as guards. After 2 weeks, 400 more Jews from Volbrom came. They had to do the heavy work in the steel factory. The work was very hard. The Jews who were too weak for it and would hurt themselves working were cruelly beaten by the Germans and the Polish overseers. Everyone who would fall ill, even with the slightest ailment, was shot immediately. Apart from this, Jews would also pass away from the frequent beatings. Every day, about 15 to 20 people were executed by pistol. We had to get up at 4 a.m. At 4:30, we stood for the roll call. Sometimes we had to come only in shirts and trousers and were not allowed to put any more clothes on. During the roll call, we were appointed to different tasks: steel factory, construction division, metal rolling workshop, repair workshop, transport division, mechanical workshop, garage, and the factory's kitchen. They would start to count us, standing in rows of 5. During the counting, some of the Ukrainian guards would take away the Jews' shoes, empty their pockets, take whatever they could find, and administer beatings. They especially enjoyed themselves while beating. On arriving on the first day, we had to give away everything we had on us, under the threat of a death penalty. Then the women and the children were murderously beaten and driven into railway carriages in the direction of Belzec. The sight was a horrible one. Wails, crying, and shouting of around 600 people was so frightful that it was heard from a distance of a few kilometers. When everyone was already standing, the Sturmmann took out his revolver and started to shoot at the crowd, supposedly at the sick, but in reality just taking wild aim. The wounded ones were wrangling on the ground in pain and agony. The Sturmmann stood and looked at them with a sarcastic and sadistic joy, and had pleasure. Most asked him to be shot on the spot in order to avoid so much awful pain. He noticed that I looked very frightened, so he ordered me to occupy myself with carrying away the wounded. Blood was dripping from their faces, so he ordered me to cover the blood streams with sand. They were buried alive. Apart from the hard labor, we prayed every morning we would be brought to work in order not to see the sad scenes. On the way to work, we were beaten, pushed, told to run. If someone fell or became a little tired, he was shot. There were victims every day. When we came to the place of work, we were counted again. Because the Ukrainians were poor mathematicians, the numbers never matched for them. Sometimes too few, sometimes too many. The counting would take hours, during which they beat us savagely. There was a Polish overseer at work, registered as a Volksdeutsch. He took revenge on us, cursed us, hit, swore, robbed us of our belongings, etc. We worked at least 10 to 12 hours. Together with the counting and the walking to work and back for 8 kilometers, a working day was about 18 hours long. 12 o'clock was the so-called lunch hour. We, the Jewish pigs they called us, were brought some water with a few pieces of bread that we had to drink standing. We would often run to the free Polish workers in the factory who received good food and lived as free people in relatively good conditions and ask them for food scraps that they did not want or could not eat. But the Poles would rather throw it to the rubbish and did not want to give it to the poor Jews. Schwamberger personally shot Rabbi Frankel, the rabbi of Wieliczka, on Yom Kippur at the time of the closing prayer in 1942. Before shooting him, Schwamberger held the following speech to Rabbi Frankel. Herr Oberrabbiner, I decided to shoot you for sabotage. Schwamberger did it in public, but a pit for him had already been dug and waiting for the whole day. It means that Schwamberger had been preparing for the spectacle. On Yom Kippur, an elderly Jew reported, I have a swollen foot. It hurts. Oh, you poor one, your foot hurts? Zeig mal. The Jew showed it slowly, and the Nazi slowly stepped on the ailing foot and crushed it so long that the Jew almost lost consciousness, and then he shot him. In Stalowa Wola, in the territory where we worked, every inch of the ground was a tomb. Before the coming of the Red Army, the Germans evacuated all the Poles from the neighborhood so that they could not tell what happened there. The territory was covered with tents. They walked around with gas masks, looked for money and things on the bodies of the buried Jews, and then poured liquid in the territory to burn the traces of cadavers. Although the lunch did not last longer than 10 minutes, it meant that it was taking too long, and we got beaten for that again. Going back, we were counted again. The counting would go until late at night because the numbers would never match. We were beaten again because of it. Everyone was searched if we hadn't taken something with us. At work, we would eat uncooked potatoes. We would get bloody diarrhea, twisted bowels, etc. We were not even allowed to go to the toilet. When someone would get sick, he was shot. We would go back in groups of 5. They warned us that if someone would escape, all the others would be shot. Because of that, friendly groups of 5 have formed. In the camp, they would start to count again for hours. We all were tired, exhausted, wet, hungry, beaten, sleepy. Then again in lines for the supper, water with dirty, polluted cabbage leaves that we were given to eat. 1.5 hours in the line, getting beaten, pushed again, and people would collapse all the time, victims of the supper queues. We went to a bath there one and only time. What a bath. We were awfully afraid because there were deaths there. Coming back to the beds, we saw that all our belongings that we had left were stolen, taken away. During the night, we could not sleep because of the moans and cries of the sick. Jews, help, they shouted. Rascals won't count the sick and shout. They should be shot. We all will be shot tomorrow. So what's the difference, a day earlier or a day later? They would stand outside and shoot people. The SS men would enter the barracks and shoot at anyone that happened to be in sight. We suffered thus until the 15th of November 1942. On that day, 250 from the remaining 600 men were selected and sent away to the steel factory in Stalowa Wola. A few days later, we were driven back with SS guards to Rozwadów to dig a grave for all the remaining Jews. About 30 persons managed to escape. Many Jews lost their lives during the Sondereinsätze. We worked for 24 hours without a pause, normally 12 to 18 hours. That means we worked for 36 and for 48 hours without sleeping and without eating. During the rest time, we cleaned toilets, carried water, chopped wood, cleaned floors, dug graves. And doing it, we had to hurry like mad, took blows, were shot at, and we would collapse while working. In November 1943, the SD in green uniforms came. Their arrival meant the liquidation of the camp. It was their mission. They traveled from camp to camp and liquidated them. Liquidation meant shoot everyone. The director of the factory, Schultz, a major in SS, opposed them with the argument that the Jews are needed in the factory. Thanks to him, many Jews were saved from the SS. Jews are qualified workers, and without them, the factory would be forced to close. 270 Jewish workers from more than 8,000 Polish ones. An intervention was made in Krakow, and after 2 weeks the SD, left to Rzeszów. In Rzeszów and in Przemysl, they liquidated the ghettos. The rest of the factory workers from Rzeszów and Przemysl had luck. They were left alive and brought to Stalowa Wola to the factory, because the factory needed workforce. And since a year had been continuously demanding some Jews for work, the Soviets bombed the factories. A bomb hit the factory and killed 3 Jews and 3 Poles. Our joy was great. It meant that the Soviets were coming very soon and that we would be saved. Because some of the bombs hadn't exploded, Jews were sent to dig out the bombs and detonate them. German officers gave the Jews precise instructions how to deal with the bombs, and themselves went away to observe from a distance if the Jews were following the instructions to the letter. For 2 years, we had been planning an escape all the time. We only waited for the approach of the Red Army. One time at night, the commander posted about 30 Jews from his people along the fence in order to prevent escapes. Nobody knew what happened. Suddenly, a commotion at night. These guards had dug a tunnel under the fence, even under the electric wires, and escaped. Hearing the story, no one knew what had happened. The Ukrainians did not know how the escape happened, but we knew. I went out in the darkness with a few more Jews and we tried to look for the tunnel. We found it. A few of us pushed ourselves through and ran in the darkness. The Jewish commander wanted to denounce me. I tried to strangle him, threw him to the ground and ran away. Hearing his shouts, the Ukrainians started to shoot. Soon the whole guard unit of 80 Nazis arrived. Because of the shooting, I could not get out of the territory of the factory, which was fenced with barbed wires. The camp was in the middle of the factory territory. The Nazi guards that had arrived running surrounded me and 2 others and shouted, "Hands up!" Seeing that I was in a trap, I ran to a pile of old metal and hid myself. The Nazi guards hadn't understood what was happening yet. They thought that it was a landing operation. They hadn't even thought that some Jews had escaped. Seeing that it was only me who had disappeared, they started to hunt the 2 others. They actually managed to catch them. I do not know what happened to them. I haven't seen them since. They spent half a day looking for me in the piles of metal, but did not find me. One Nazi was searching not far from me. I hit him on the head from behind with a metal rod. He died. The rest looked for him, but could not find him. I covered him with pieces of metal. I spent 8 days there, hidden, without food, without water, without air. I could not get out because the place was guarded by Germans day and night. I was sure I would never get out of there. There were tens of thousands of metal pieces there. It seems that the tracker dogs could not find me. It is possible that metal also masks the traces of smell. The following is testimony of a Jewish business owner recorded shortly after the November program in 1938, describing the progression of laws that led to the destruction of his business and those of other Jews, including the boycott of Jewish businesses and suppliers, the refusal to issue travel permits, and the introduction of extra taxes. He also describes attacks on Jewish individuals and property, including mob attacks and window smashing. He goes on to describe in detail the events of the November program in his home and neighborhood, including attacks on his family and the destruction and seizure of his property. He and his brother were arrested in Munich shortly after, and he describes what life was like for him and other Jewish men at the Dachau concentration camp, including attacks and incidents he observed during his short time there. The general Judengesetze in the Third Reich are known. Before I go in detail into the events of 10th November 1938, I would like briefly to list the reasons which led to the ruin of our business. Customers started the boycott immediately after the seizure of power. It intensified continuously, not so much voluntarily as through coercive means on the part of the state and the party. However, Since this did not lead to the destruction of Jewish businesses fast enough for the party, a boycott by suppliers was later instigated. First, the Reichsnachstand blocked the delivery of flour and semolina. Then consignments of foreign goods were also blocked: oil, citrus fruit, later partly cocoa, chocolate, rice. At the end of 1937, the national salt mines in Munich informed us that they would no longer supply salt. In the middle of 1938, the South German sugar works, with whom we had done a lot of business for decades, made the same announcement. At the same time, the manufacturers of branded goods partly started to block deliveries. Early on, a number of customers cited the party in cases of non-payment. Since all our demands were justified, we mostly took no notice of that, although we sometimes received directly threatening letters from the party telling us not to take any action against debtors. Initially, contact with the authorities was still polite. At the end of December 1937, the district office in Weissenberg refused to issue travel permits, which was actually 9 months before the corresponding Reich law was passed. This made any travel impossible, which would inevitably lead to the demise of most wholesale businesses. In 1938, the Finanzamt belatedly collected the sum of 35,000 marks for turnover tax. During a meeting at the Finanzamt to apply for a refund, the clerk said that if an appeal was lodged, the regional tax office would carry out a further audit of turnover tax. The only reason this did not occur was because of the events of November. The situation was such that for years it had been almost impossible to let children out on the streets on their own. Adults were also not safe from being accosted by school children. Until the start of 1938, complaints to the constabulary resulted in some peace. Later, even complaints were pointless. Window smashing was in part prevented by the glass insurance companies. Any purchases made in Jewish shops and talking to or greeting of a Jew by a non-Jew were immediately reported to the mayor, who called the culprits in. They were excluded from city deliveries, support, etc. In May 1938, hairdressers agreed not to serve Jews anymore. Individual craftsmen had already been doing this earlier. At the beginning of autumn 1938, during the Czech war crisis, animosities visibly increased. Being jostled by people large and small, stone throwing, window smashing, removal of shutters during the day were not uncommon. The unrest and nervousness increased even further when it was learnt from various Jewish Gemeinden that Jews had been forced to leave their houses on the high holidays, leaving their goods and chattels wherever they were, and sell the synagogues at ludicrously low prices, in some cases for a few marks. I want to add that my 17-year-old daughter witnessed a mob attack during the Juni-Action in Berlin. The Jewish girls' boarding school was attacked. A telephone call to the Berlin Überfallkommando prompted the question as to whether non-Aryans were involved, in which case it would not be a matter for the Überfallkommando. On 10th November 1938, between 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning, I heard steps in the garden. When I looked out of the window, 8 to 10 men, the SA, also called the brown shirts, were standing, heavily armed with axes, hatchets, daggers, and revolvers. By the time I woke my wife and my 11-year-old son, a man was already in the bedroom who ordered us to go to the basement and immediately started to smash everything to pieces: the washing jug and bowl, mirrors, windows, furniture, doors, etc. After we, which included my sister-in-law and daughter, had been in the basement for a short time, I was called up. When my daughter wanted to come with me, she was pushed back. Somebody yelled at me, "Du lump, you know that since 12 o'clock midnight, you have been declared fair game for us. Give us your documents." By the time I had unlocked the desk, I had received such a blow to the face that my glasses fell off and broke. My right eye swelled up heavily and my pupil was paralyzed. The doctor explained later that I could have lost my sight from this blow. Then I was shoved into a corner and indiscriminately pelted with items of furniture. That I only sustained 3 flesh wounds and no serious injury has to be described as extremely lucky. In the meantime, the entire house was wrecked in the way described above. In the kitchen, every last piece of crockery was smashed. In the basement, my wife was hit on the head with a full tin of food. The women had to smash wine bottles and jam jars themselves. After the SA came the mob, then the school children. Each party destroyed and stole yet more. It can be stated without any doubt that the SA took away the contents of the writing desk: a gentleman's gold wristwatch, a new gentleman's wristwatch, 120 marks in cash, a wedding ring, a necklace. A lady's gold wristwatch and a girl's ring were also stolen on the same Thursday. It should be added that a part of the large tiled stoves and the grand piano were also destroyed. By the time my wife got round to packing a few days later, all the wardrobes and drawers were almost completely empty, so that almost all the clothes and most of the underwear had been stolen. All Jewish homes were treated in this way. On the 10th November, after the various destruction operations, we were allowed to pack some underwear and clothes and had to go to the railway station through rows of the rabble and accompanied by their jeers. Some who remained were badly mistreated the same evening, partly by the SA. In the Rathaus, the 70-year-old doctor was so upset by it that he took his own life. The remaining Jews had to leave town the following day, which brought the century-old Jewish community to an end. We went to Munich, where I met my brother who had traveled a few hours earlier. After a short stay, my brother and I were arrested. After various personal details had been taken down, we were taken to Dachau. There, various personal details were recorded again. We were photographed and had to wait for hours until we got to the bathhouse. There we were brought before the doctor after the bath and had to announce, "Schutzhaft Jude, respectfully reporting." Because we had not announced ourselves loud enough, we were slapped round the face in front of the Stabsarzt. Examinations were not carried out. We were simply asked, ill or had an accident. After the examination, we came out into the open from the warm bathhouse, dressed only in short shirts, socks, trousers, and cotton drill jacket. We all had to stand until midnight, whether we had been imprisoned early that morning or later. SS men watched us, and if anybody was seen not standing to attention properly, there were slaps around the face and shoves. After 12 o'clock, we were led to the barracks. There we received the only food of the day, tea and Kommissbrot. The barracks themselves were split into 4 dormitories. Each dormitory consisted of 2 rooms, intended for 50 men. However, they were occupied by 200. The washroom and toilet were accordingly insufficient. Initially, 4 men had to make do with 1 towel, which was also used for drying the crockery. Later, towels and underpants could be bought in the canteen. The daily routine was roughly as follows: wake up at 5 o'clock, wash, coffee. We were allowed to eat in the barracks, but there were blocks where almost always one had to eat and drink outside standing. This depended on the Stubenältester, an Aryan prisoner, who, of course, were never taken to task by the SS in charge for bad treatment of the Jews. Since the rooms had to be cleaned before the apple or assembly, it was necessary to leave them at 5:30. We then had to wait for some time on the camp road before we were led to the assembly. After the assembly, the cleaning crew, which included me most of the time, was allowed to stand down, whereas most people had to march and do exercise in all weathers until after 11 o'clock. Initially, Jewish former officers were allowed to be in charge, but later only Aryans. After lunch, we usually had 30 to 60 minutes free time. Then it was assembly again, marching and exercise again, and after a short break, evening assembly. After the evening meal, we were free until bedtime, 8 o'clock. On the assembly point, as in the whole camp and even in the barracks, one was never safe from SS checks. These almost never passed without beatings and shoving. On one occasion, I was helping a sick person along when an SS man came and ordered me to let him walk by himself and gave me a push from behind for no other reason. Similarly, I had a broom thrown at my head when I did not carry out an order fast enough in the barracks, but luckily without being hit. Everybody had to go to the assembly, whether sick or old. So it happened that the sick and weak often had to be carried by 2 to 4 men. People who reported to the doctor were often sent away 2 to 3 times before they were seen. Then they were often discharged without any or insufficient examination and without decent treatment. On one occasion, all the Jewish blocks, 10,000 men, had to stand on the assembly point from lunchtime till 6 o'clock in the evening. Standing still for 30 to 60 minutes on the Appellplatz was not uncommon, especially during the evening assembly. We were often bullied by having to stand still for longer than usual instead of being allowed to move. An SS man asked a 70 man for his name. When he gave it without the prerequisite addition, Schutzhaftjude, he was twice slapped round the face so hard that he fell over. Shortly afterwards, the man was released and died 2 days. After his release from the camp, another man died 2 hours after his return to Munich. An approximately 60-year-old man with a bladder complaint asked to be allowed to relieve himself. When this was refused and he replied something, he was hit so hard that he fell over. His comrades were forbidden to help him up. In the presence of the SS, he was so badly beaten by the Stubeneltester, an Aryan prisoner, that he was dead when he was carried off the square. One evening, a Munich latrine cleaner reported to the doctor with appendix pains. He was refused treatment and had to return to the barracks. The following morning, the man called for help. A few minutes later, a colleague had to confirm that he was dead. It could not be ascertained whether a ruptured appendix or heart attack had been the cause. On release day, after having coffee, we had to stand from 5 o'clock in the morning until the train left Dachau at 4 o'clock in the afternoon without any other food. Even whilst I was still in Dachau, my wife was threatened that I would not be released from the camp until my siblings abroad had their mortgages on my property cancelled. In fact, although I was released earlier, I had to sell my house for 14,000 marks, which had a value of at least 23,000 taking all the warehouses into account. A further 2,500 marks was deducted from that for damages caused by the SA. In the above report, I have, almost without exception, mentioned only facts that I have seen with my own eyes. Anything else, especially from other blocks, I have left out, even if it had been reported by an absolutely trustworthy source. The United Kingdom declared war on Nazi Germany on 3rd September 1939 after the German invasion of Poland. After the defeat of France in the spring of 1940, the British Expeditionary Force withdrew from the European continent. Although the Channel Islands near the French coast did fall into German hands, from the summer of 1940 until 1945, mainland Britain resisted German invasion and became a refuge for many governments in exile and refugees of the occupied countries in Europe.